Now that we've cached out the particles for these bug trails, let's go ahead and start setting up the rendering for these. So let's give these some interesting color based on their age relative to their life. So oftentimes I'll drop in a wrangle and call this render attributes. And then we can set some of the color and alpha values on the particles that will be used at render time. And let's start with perhaps the color, and we can fade this off from maybe a white color at the beginning to a red color at the end. So I'm going to start by setting up a variable in my wrangle that represents the blend amount from the start to the end of the particle trail. So I'll create a float local variable called color blend, and this is going to be based on the age. So I'll do a fit function on the age attribute, and we'll blend that from an age of 0, and you can then blend that up through the end of the lifespan, or if you want this to achieve its end color a little bit sooner, we can set a different value that's a bit less than the overall life of the particle. So we could try a value of 0.7 perhaps. This might give us a more consistent endpoint for that color ramp, since the life does vary between the particles. So I'll go from an age of 0 to 0.7 seconds, and we'll blend this variable just from 0 to 1. So now we can see what this looks like just by setting the color equal to that color blend variable that we just created. So I'll say cd equals color blend, and you can see we now have this 0 to 1 value, with it going fully to 1 a bit before it reaches the end of the trail. So this is cool, but let's set up a nice ramp for the color distribution across the length of the trail. So instead of just setting the color equal to the color blend, let's use a ramp. So I'll say ch ramp, and I'll call this color ramp. And make sure that when you type in a name for this ramp parameter that there are no spaces in here. It has to be a complete string without any white space. And then we'll pass in a value for it to evaluate the ramp position. So then we'll pass in this color blend that we just used, and this will determine what point of the ramp that we're querying for a color for a given particle. And right now this won't do anything because this color ramp doesn't exist. So just hit this little button here, and that will create any of these missing channel references that we've specified in our Vexpression here. So that's created this color ramp for us down here, and we can now set this to be an interesting color. And actually this is just giving us scalar values right now. So let's go into our parameter interface and go to the color ramp down here, and this default ramp type is float, and we can switch this to color so that we can specify an actual RGB value for all the ramp positions. So let's accept that, and now you can see we have this black to black color ramp. So let's select the first point, and I'll make this pure white. So I'll go to maybe HSV, make that pure white there. And for the end color, I'm going to make this red. So I'll click on the end point, and maybe we'll make this not pure super bright red. I'll do kind of a half red, 0.5, and I like to make sure the other color components are not pure 0. So I'll just add a small value there, 0.01. And if you want to, you can get more creative with this ramp as well. You can add some other points in between if you want to go for some sort of, interesting magical stylized effect. So you can see here we can add some other colors along this distribution if we would like. But for our purposes, I'm going to keep it simple and just do a white to red blend. And now we can set an alpha value as well to determine the transparency of these particles. And when you're rendering with lots of particles, it can be good to make them all semi-transparent. So let's set an alpha attribute, and I'll start by setting this equal to a low value. Let's try something like 0.1. And because we have so many particles stacked up on top of each other, this is still rendering fairly solid in our viewport because we have tons of particles in one place. And these lower alpha values really help this to not look, kind of spotty when you have fewer particles here. And the viewport is a decent representation of what these values look like, but you really need to start rendering this to see what it really looks like in the end, because the viewport's really just kind of a preview. And it looks like this alpha value of 0.1 works reasonably well for the particles in general, but let's ramp it down to 0 by the end of its lifespan. So for the alpha, I'll use a fit function on this once again, and I'll fit the age, and we'll start at 0 and ramp that to whatever the life of the particle is, represented by its life attribute, and we'll ramp that alpha value from 0.1 when the age is 0 down to an alpha value of 0 at the end of its lifespan, so that they kind of disappear smoothly as the particles die out. So when we do that, you can see we get this nice faint trail off to these particles. This might be a bit more visible if I switch my background to dark. Hopefully you can see that a little bit better. This looks kind of spotty, but once again, that's just a viewport preview. Now let's set up some render nulls for the bugs and the trails. I'll call this one render trails, and then we can create another one for the bugs. I'll call this one render bugs, and just for viewport convenience purposes, if you want to, you can merge these together so that you can view them together more easily when you're working on the scene here without worrying about your template view. And now let's set up some render objects for the bugs and the trails. So back up top where we've set up our other geometry objects for rendering, I'm going to create a new one and call this render bugs, and a second one called render trails. Make those red again, and for the bugs, I'm going to use the same material as I'm using for the creatures, so that'll be under material context, mat/rs creature metal. And then for the render trails, we're going to tell Redshift to render these as particles. So go to the Redshift object parameters, and under the render tab, let's turn on mesh deformations blur from velocity attribute, and that's defaulting to V, which is correct. And over on the particles tab, let's turn on render object as particles. Now for these particle trails, we'll need to create a new material for that. So go to the material context, and let's create a new RS material builder. And I'm going to call this RS bug trails and dive inside here. And we don't want to compute any lighting on these particle trails. We want to just render pure colored trails that don't care at all about the lights in the scene. And this is a common thing, particularly if you're doing something like sparks or magical effects that you want to maybe emit some color instead of just being dependent on the color they receive from lighting. So let's open up the base properties. And actually, we don't need to drive any of these base properties with the particle attributes. So actually, let's close that, go to the base properties and the parameters instead, and set the diffuse weight to 0 so we don't get any diffuse lighting computed on these particles. Then open up the overall drop down here, and we can drive the opacity with the alpha attribute and the emission color with our color attribute. So now let's drop in an RS point attribute for each of those. I'll just copy this to get another copy of that. And on the first one, let's tell this to look up the alpha attribute and then connect this out color to the opacity color. And for the second one, let's look up the CD attribute, connect that out color to the emission color. And then let's go back to the mechanical bugs section of our setup here and perhaps move our test camera into position. So I'll select the test camera, hit the lock icon here, and zoom in on some of our particle trails. So let's get a closer look at this one here. And then I'll unlock that camera to leave it there. And then let's finally open up our Redshift render view. And actually, before we start rendering this, we need to set up a Redshift render ROP that will be pointing to the new render objects we've created. So I'm going to leave the wide ENV and wide creature Redshift ROPs alone and create a new one just for the bugs. So let's copy this ENV perhaps and paste that here and rename this to bugs and trails. And then for the force objects parameter, let's select the render bugs and render trails objects and accept that. And for now, I'm just going to remove the forest phantom for the render creatures here so that we're only bringing in the bugs and trails for this render. Let's select the correct ROP. That's wide bugs and trails. And let's select the test camera. And it looks like when trying to run this render, we're seeing this error about OCIO display/view settings. And before this, it said couldn't load the ACES processor or something to that effect. And I actually kind of like running into these little problems so that you can see some of the things you need to watch out for and what the fixes for those are. So if we look at the camera settings on our main wide render camera, you can see we have under Redshift camera tab, OCIO/post effects. The OCIO display and view has all of these settings we would expect, but on this test camera, maybe this was an old test camera that we created before updating the ACES configuration on this machine, but this is not bringing in any options for the OCIO view here. So to fix this, let's go to Edit Parameter Interface for that test camera and scroll down to the Redshift camera, and then under the OCIO/post effects, delete the OCIO color management tab and the display and view parameters. So when you delete those and hit accept, you can see they're no longer there. And then back on the Redshift shelf with this camera selected, hit the camera parameters button, and that will rebuild these missing parameters here. And we now have access to these controls once again. And I'll set that to Rec 709 and try rendering this once again. And this is still black because we made a very silly mistake. Let's turn off the IPR. We went through all this trouble of building our cameras and Redshift ROP and setting up our render objects, but we didn't actually merge in the things we're rendering. That's a pretty important step. We should probably do that. Go into the render bugs and drop in an object merge, and we'll point this to object/particles mechanical bugs and point this one to render bugs. And I'll copy this object merge, then we can go into our render trails geometry object, paste that in there, and instead of pointing this to render bugs, let's just change that to point to render trails. So now after fixing that silly mistake, let's try rendering once again, and sure enough, we have our bugs and particle trails rendering successfully. And the bugs look correct, but the trails are just rendering with this plain white shader here, and I'm guessing that's probably not picking up the material that we created for it. So let's minimize the render view, go back to our render trails object. Sure enough, on the render tab, we've created that material for it, but we hadn't assigned it. So let's point this to RS bug trails and then refresh our current render. So now these particle trails have updated here, but they're looking really dark. If we check the alpha value for this render, it looks like the alpha is being picked up correctly and being used properly as the opacity for all of the particles, but we're still not getting our nice white to red color ramp applied to the particle colors. So let's check our material again and jump over to RS bug trails. Let's minimize that render view, dive inside the material, and on the material here, under the overall tab, we've attached our CD lookup into the emission color, but on the material itself, the emission weight is set to 0, so it's not really having any effect. So let's turn the emission weight up to 1. And these particle trails are looking pretty cool. They're nice and interesting and kind of aesthetically appealing, but I used them fairly subtly in the comp for this project. And we've been rendering the bugs and the trails together so far, just for testing purposes, but for your final renders I'd recommend rendering them separately so that you can control them more easily in compositing. So on the left here we have the bugs only, on the right we have the trails only, and I'm looking at the explosion shot here because this is a little bit of a closer view than the wide shot gives us. And yeah, this is looking pretty nice, but with so much happening in the scene, with the explosions and destruction and creature disintegration and the water and everything else, if we have these really elaborate trails on top of all of that, it can be a little bit noisy visually. So on the compositing side, I chose to really dial these back quite a bit, and you'll find yourself using compositing to finesse the look of particle effects in particular. When it comes to particle stuff, it's very highly dependent on how you treat it in the comp. So back in Fusion Studio here, this isn't the most advanced particle comp by any stretch, but if we take a look at how it's being used for this shot, kind of zoom in on these bugs here, I'm just applying the particle trails with a very, very low blend value. You can see it's just a super subtle amount there. I'm using 0.01 in this particular case. It looks kind of cool if we increase the blend and we have these dramatic trails, but I just made it very subtle. So 0.01 gives us a very just thin line trailing behind these bugs here, but I also wanted to add a bit of a glow to this, so I've used this multi-step blur, which I believe I installed through Fusion's Reactor plugin. And if you look at the multi-step blur by itself, you can see that's doing this kind of nice glow effect on that trail. And I'm merging that in a little bit more heavily than I am the actual original trail itself. So it's just kind of creating this subtle, I don't know, almost ethereal vibe to these trails here. So a lot of the effects you ultimately work on in production aren't necessarily going to be super prominent. Sometimes it's these little subtle things that can just add so much to a shot. And for your projects, feel free to go crazier with the look of the particles, make them more prominent if you want to. But for, my artistic purposes here, I liked making it just kind of a nice subtle thing. And just referring back to the intro video for the class, this is what those effects looked like across these few shots.